Hold on.
Oh, shoot. Yes,
Okay,
please.
okay. Actually, say everything you just said, but start. Yeah.
Okay. No, no worries. Okay, so I'm glad you stopped me when you're done.
Yeah.
Um, so one of the points that I wanted to talk about was universality versus context specificity. Um, and basically just kind of where you stand and how you believe that like that impacts people. So basically like universality is the belief that stages are universal. So like people experience things in very similar ways. And the context one is more about like people don't experience things anything somewhat similar. It's all very individualistic. Um, when I was reading that, I was thinking it immediately made me think about on TikTok when they're like, I've never had an original experience, you know? And so I personally I believe and think that like, you know, the truth lies somewhere in the middle, but I kind of fall more towards that universal belief of like people really do go through these um these stages of life in a very similar way no matter how they grew up or where they're at. Although I'll get into how I believe that that's incredibly important. But anyways, I just kind of wondered if you felt like you have in the reading as it's gone through some of these, you know, seasons of life and broken it down, if you felt like you really relate to that, or if you feel like yours was much more contextual to you.
Yeah. I guess you're kind of referring to like the McGoldrickson family life
Yes.
cycle and like Erickson, his stuff that he was talking about in the lecture, right?
Yes.
Like infancy and autonomy. Okay.
Yes.
Um, yeah, that's a great question. I think that uh I really loved like reading through specifically like the McGoldrickson family life cycle. Let me pull it up so I can just have it for reference. But it kind of talked
Yeah. Go.
about I just really resonated with it personally because I just felt like it was so spot on for the place I am in life right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's see. Where? Oh, that was in the other lecture. Let's see. The family life cycle model lecture. Okay. But yeah, basically, I I'm it's weird reading through all this stuff, like about emerging adulthood and stuff because this is like the age that you and I are both at. I'm 20, you're
Mm-hmm.
23. So like and I relate to a lot of it. But at the same time, um he kind of talks about like marriage as being the thing that pushes you into adulthood. Like he kind of talks about like the reason emerging adulthood goes into later years is because there's like a late age of marriages now. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but that's weird for me because I just got married like last month.
Oh,
So
congrats.
yeah, yeah, thank you. So I just got married. So that's and I'm gonna make lots of references to that. I'm not trying to like shove it down your throat or anything.
No,
It's
no,
just like
you're good.
it's just like relevant.
Yeah,
Um,
definitely.
so it's weird being like technically an emerging adult, but also kind of like finding that separation from my family. Like I'm looking at the lecture now. Yeah, the stages of the life cycle that Carrie Lampton talked about, Professor Carrie talked about. Stage
Mm-hmm.
one was single young adults leave home, and then stage two is the new couple joins their families through marriage, which is in that's like the experience in life I'm at right now, but that's like not statistically where I'm supposed to be. Like statistically speaking, I should be
Yeah.
like 25, I think is what it was that research said.
Right.
Um, but like getting to go through that now, and having, to form to my own sort of marital system, realigning my relationships with extended families and friends. I feel like I'm kind of being forced to push myself outside of the emerging adulthood thing.
Mm-hmm.
Not completely, but I'm I don't think that I'm going to be 25 and still an emerging adult. I think that it's gonna be a little
Yeah.
bit accelerated. Yeah.
No, I definitely. So, from what I read about emerging adulthood, it specifically talked about like being 21. And for me specifically, like when I was 21, marriage was still something that was like so far off. And so that, I think that's actually kind of an interesting difference between you and I, because you're younger than me, but you were already kind of in that position. Whereas I'm still definitely in like I just really related with the emerging adult. And it's interesting how that has changed in the last, several decades. And so you probably would fit in better, with kind of our grandparents' generation, like they were getting married at those times, right?
Right. Yeah.
And so yeah, that's really interesting. And my grandma all the time is constantly like, I want great grandchildren and blah blah blah. And I'm like, I don't know, you're gonna have to talk to my cousins, because like I am nowhere close to that. um but when we talk about it all the time, because when she was 20, that's when she got married. She had her first kid by
Yeah.
21. And one of my favorite things to like discuss and talk about and read research is kind of the wave of feminism and how that has impacted almost everything around marriage, childbearing, work, education, all of that. And the reading goes into it a bit, but yeah, I mean, with the introduction of birth control, women were, suddenly able to go to be educated for much longer. And with a higher education, we're able to enter in the workforce. And so it was consistently pushing back those milestones that women were reaching much younger.
Yeah, for sure.
So that's really interesting, that because I definitely don't, I feel that in whole in between. But I think you're so right with like being married at 20, you're definitely going to experience all of these things that it talks about with that come with marriage at a much younger age. um However, in our own little bubble of JBU and these things, is that pretty common, like for people to be married younger?
Yeah, I actually like wrote that down. Yeah, you kind of just touched on it, but like uh the reading that we did talked about like, reasons for later marriage being like birth control, more relaxed sexual morals because of like the
Mm-hmm.
sexual revolution of the 70s, finishing education, not wanting the perils of marriage, and kind of like this idea of like, oh, like you're young, you should be going exploring, and like getting wasted and sleeping around and stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, like at JBU, this doesn't feel like it's the case at all. Like I think that um, like obviously like the faith has the most to do with it, I would say. Just like being a Christian campus. And I don't know where you're at with it, but like I'm a Christian, so for
Mm-hmm.
me, I wasn't ever, I wasn't planning on like having sex outside of marriage. So I think that like having the sexual relationship outside of marriage, makes it feel like, oh, like I don't need to get married yet, but like when you do desire that, um, but you also believe that sex is designed for marriage, that you are probably more inclined to get married at a younger age. I think
Yeah.
that's probably definitely the case for me.
Yeah. One of the girls in my classes, she was talking about how she's 22 and she feels so behind because like she's not married yet or not even in a relationship. And I was like, I'm 23 and I feel right on track. Like I feel like, that's not really in the books for me at the moment. But my background is I am Christian, but it was definitely like I went to public school and
Right.
didn't
Yeah.
always identify as that. So that's something that I kind of came into in my, early adulthood. Um, and so it's interesting to hear kind of how these people feel. It's a different kind of culture that have fallen into, but it's just interesting. Not one's better or worse or right or wrong, but just definitely an interesting difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
One, yeah. Well, one more thing I'll touch on this. If
Mhm.
you might have wanted to move on, but
No, you're good. You're
um,
good.
we were kind of talking about like where we fit in the emerging adulthood thing, and I think it was the article on emerging adulthood actually. They talked about like the criteria for adulthood, um, being like, I think they listed three things. It was accepting responsibility for yourself, making independent decisions, and then becoming financially independent.
Hmm.
Um, and I don't know how you feel about those things. but I am definitely not there. Like
Yeah.
I'm I'm in college. I'm going to JBU. Like I can't afford to pay myself through school on myself. So I'm not technically financially independent. And because of that, it makes me feel more adolescent. But
Yes.
but at the same time, being married and being, living by myself, I do have responsibility for myself and I have the ability to like make my own independent decisions. I just feel
Mm-hmm.
like it's like the finances that are holding me in adolescence almost, which is a strange thing.
No, I couldn't agree with that more. Like my parents still live in Kansas City, and so I live down here by myself. But very similar. Like I mean, I'm working through school, and so, but I'm not financially independent from them. So like I have my own place, and I there is it. Let me find it. I wrote it down talking about how like you don't have to tell your parents anymore like where you're at or all of these things.
Right.
Kind of
Yeah.
the marks of adulthood, but then at the same time, like, hey, can I need some help with groceries this week? So it's like I definitely
Yeah.
still feel that adolescence in I think it absolutely is kind of like the last kind of creeping thing that's like pulling me into that. Whereas when I'm able to overcome that and go into the career field that I choose and want to, that I will then hopefully feel more of a adult established.
Yeah. Right.
So with that actually kind of is a perfect gateway. So with you being married, that's obviously by definition a much more stable relationship. Um, in emerging adulthood, it talks about instability, one of the big ones being relationships. Do you feel like that has become a stable thing for you, or do you feel like your instability could still be defined in different ways?
That's a question. I think that I don't feel a lot of instability in my relationships. I'd say
Yeah.
like I don't really know how much, spiritual emphasis
Mhm.
the emerging adulthood article has, but if anything, it would just be, in my relationship with Christ. Like it's a,
Mm.
as like I'm entering this age of adulthood, Erickson kind of talked when we look at it. Erickson talked about, like the identity versus identity confusion, like who am I and what am I all about?
Hmm.
Like kind of really just recently, probably like when I was 18, that's when I came to start experiencing that. Um,
Yeah.
so like I'm still working through that, I think just like as a young man. Um, so I think if anything, yeah, that instability it wouldn't be with my wife or any relationships I have on this earth. It would definitely be with God.
Yeah. Interesting. Because I think, the definition that it has for instability, I feel like that can kind of have some negative connotation. And like,
Yeah,
so in this, obviously in this context, which I'm sure you understand, but just for the sake of conversation, like instability meaning, like not necessarily long term and concrete, where stability meaning those things. And so, marriage obviously is one of those things that's going to be a lot more concrete and stable.
right.
Instability, I feel like some relationships in my life that have been kind of unstable in the context of this is like roommates, right? Like you live with them for a year or two and then all of a sudden they're kind of out of your life. And so I think that I'm definitely still in that in unstable instability context of relationships where it doesn't, and I just like clarified to myself, like it doesn't mean that it's not insignificant. Like it's still a significant relationship. It's just like moving and constant change. And
Right.
that is really the unstable part of this part of development.
Yeah, and hearing you, expand on the context of what you're saying. Yeah, I would definitely say the instability for me is probably also like just with college friends.
Yeah.
Like it's just my friends like graduating last year and this year and stuff. It's just like weird to have to build a relationship with them and intentionally pursue them, but like also understand they're going to be gone next year and won't see them probably ever again.
Yeah. It's super weird. I think your college friends, like that's one of the hardest ones for me to transition from and let go of was it's like, oh, now we're actually like moving states, not just
Yeah.
like an hour or two away. Okay. Something else, if you don't mind. I think that like the nature versus nurture argument has always been really interesting to me. The reading tapped into it. I know it went into the lecture a little bit, what are your opinions on how that impacts a person?
By the reading, are you talking about like the textbook reading, like chapter 2?
Yes.
Okay, cool. Um, yeah, that was a super. I actually really enjoyed that chapter. I think the front half of it was like pretty term heavy, biologically speaking, lots of
Yeah.
cell talk and genes and stuff like that. But yeah, I really enjoyed the gene interplay section, or the gene environment interplay. Um, so you just asked like, what's my take on nurture versus nature?
Yeah, do you feel like one impacts a character more or less, or do you feel, are you kind of a right down the middle kind of person?
Um, I think I've had a lot of experience in trauma therapy,
Mm,
as like a patient or a client, I guess. So in
mhm,
trauma therapy, a lot of their thing is like, there's certainly some nature aspects to it, but a lot of it is like nurture and like
mhm.
how your environment and your family systems have affected the way you are. So I think I'm naturally more of like a nurture leaner. Um, but something the book said that was really interesting is just talking about like the implications of like the gene or the passive gene environment correlation, the evocative gene environment correlation, active gene environment correlation. Talk
Mhm.
about the implications being essentially that nature like forces the individual to seek nurture. So
Mm,
like we basically saying like we can't assume that like environmental influences are important when like uh measures of the environment may like partly reflect on the individual's genetic makeup. Like it talked about, if you're bred just genetically to like pursue one type of person, like an extroverted person, um, then is that really nurture that that extroverted person affected you, or is it more like nature that you pursued that person in the first place? I thought that was actually pretty interesting. Is like the way our nature actually affects the type of nurture that we would go to in the first place.
yeah, no, definitely. I definitely agree with, I lean more towards nurture. Just because even in the, I can't remember what reading it was in, but it literally talks about how like there are things that are incredibly difficult to come out of, right? So like poverty, broken homes,
Yeah,
addiction, all of these things where those are incredibly difficult to recover from just as an individual. And I feel like that nurturing environment or lack therefore of um, is incredibly impactful, if not the most, to how a person comes out, right? Um,
for sure.
when I was in my undergrad, I worked at a rehab facilitation for women drug addicts. And I think that that was kind of immediately where my brain went when I read that, because it was like, so often, if not the majority of the time, these women were like, well, my mom did this drug and my dad did this and my grandparents. And so it's like I just constantly saw these cycles of
Yeah,
poverty and addiction. And it was creating these people who are, you know, genuinely good people. And it's like how much of that of who they are was impacted by what was just around them and what they were born into, you know?
exactly. Yeah, like I would look at that and be like, of course you're going through the things you're going through. Like I don't know how
Right.
you couldn't not. That makes perfect sense to me.
Exactly. Exactly. So I always, I mean, of course, like I understand that there is, these are all very much so like the truth lies somewhere in between and in the middle.
For sure.
Um, but that one specifically, I really argue for more so nurture than anything else, just because of what I've experienced, you know, and what I've
Yeah,
seen.
I would definitely say the same for me as well.
Okay. Did you are you familiar with like the first order and second order changes? Did you look into that at all?
I read about them and I saw him talking about them in the lecture. Yeah,
Okay,
that's
cool.
the first time I heard of them, but I know about
Same.
them now.
Yeah, 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 yeah. I never had really heard it broken down in that way. Um, so yeah, I guess just kind of what are the differences that you have seen in the first order and second order? Just kind of a quiz ourselves.
Yeah, that's a hard question. So remind me, first order is like just like almost like behavioral changes, while second order is like actual mindset change, right?
Yes.
That's kind of the gist of it.
That's kind of how I felt about it too. It like second order is it's interesting because they say you can't go back from it. But yeah, I think it's like a deep personal change where you wouldn't want to go back, right?
right. Yeah.
That was kind of my understanding of it.
Okay. Did you have like an answer lined up? Because it's hard to think of for sure.
I didn't quite catch that. It seemed like it broke out a little bit.
Oh, did you have like an answer for that? Because I can't think of anything
No, I
like
think you
right
answered
off
it
the top of my head.
perfectly.
Well, I just mean like you kind of asked like for an example, right? Of something like that.
Oh gosh. Um, okay, that is a hard question. I don't know if I'd be able to have an example in my own life. Um, I thought that the smoking example that the professor gave was a really good one in order to kind of illustrate specifically what this meant, and that really made it more concrete. But yeah, I don't know if I would be able to find one in my own life besides the other example that I gave of leaving the home and becoming emotionally and somewhat financially responsible for myself.
Yeah.
So that's kind of where I'm at with that.
Yeah, that makes sense. Whenever I hear like second order changes, my mind like immediately goes to like the spiritual, I guess,
Mm,
aspect of it, and like, kind of the idea of like making God's desires my desires,
mhm.
Um, that's kind of like immediately what my mind went to whenever I heard that. Like like not wanting to sin and stuff like that. Like it's easy to do the first order change of like just not sinning and stopping, you know, lying or lusting or something like that.
Yeah.
But like the real challenge is like those temptations just being like completely removed though, which I feel like is would be a second order change
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
from the
yeah,
Lord.
definitely. Like
That
kind of
that's the
when
only
Paul
example I
talks
could think of.
about, like when he talks about like I do the things I hate even though I don't want to do them, and it's like that's absolutely kind of where that would fit in.
Yeah, exactly. He's struggling with like the first order change when he needs to be get into that second order. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. No, that's a great comparison connection. Okay, well, I think that we have hit at 20 minutes. If there's anything else that you wanted to discuss or wanted to bring up.
Um, I don't know. We kind of like summed up a lot of what my notes were on, honestly.
Same.
Was there anything else that you had written down?
Um, we kind of talked about it a little bit, but just like adolescence was usually associated with that identity formation, and now it's coming into this emerging adulthood, and how you and I kind of both related on that.
Mhm.
That was really the only other thing. So yeah, I think we did a great job of summing up these things.